Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I am here today with Jamie York. Welcome, Jamie. How are you?
Doing okay. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Absolutely. So today I wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about your company. You have a very unique approach to learning and to teaching. Uh, you've had a great deal of success with an online course. And what I want to do is get a little bit of your feelings on what the state of education is like today in the modern sense in 2023. So a lot of parents that are out there that are sending their kids to school, and they're having trouble in the area that you happen to specialize in, which is mathematics. I know your academy does more, but one of the great things that you came up with was this this book, Making Math Meaningful. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. How did you get into mathematics as a general topic of teaching?
Right. Well, you've mentioned a few things there that gets my mind going quite a bit, but I have a background as a computer programmer, 2 degrees in computer science, and I was going down that road to be a software engineer, a computer programmer, and it was just before I graduated that I really kind of fell in love with teaching. I was tutoring as, somebody who was in my early 20s. I was tutoring a student in math, and I really enjoyed it. Met some interesting people that were teachers themselves, and I decided, yeah, this is what I'd like to do. This is where I'd like to dedicate my life. And I'd say that my first experience with that, even though it was fairly mainstream, I was teaching in a boarding school, and it was very positive in many ways. I had some sort of life experiences and so forth, traveling around the world, etc., where I realized I was looking for an educational system that really had a philosophy behind it, meaningfulness behind it, really. And I had developed this feeling over, many, many years. In fact, I have this memory of sitting in, I'll share this story if that's okay.
Yeah, of
Sitting
course.
in, it was my first day of ninth grade, and I was in a large public school. In terms of middle school, my experience, I had some very good teachers, some teachers that were perhaps weren't that great. And I had worked, for a middle school student, I'd worked fairly hard, done all my homework, really made sure that I had good grades, that whole thing. And here I am the first day of ninth grade sitting in the auditorium of this big public school. You could probably imagine this. I can imagine that they probably had us sit in alphabetical order. And so I mentioned that because I was like at the back at the end because my last name's York, and who knows who I was sitting next to. It probably was definitely not my friends. And the principal was addressing the class, the new ninth grade students, and he was intending to motivate us, inspire us in some way. And I still remember this. And this is a very long time ago, right? Um, you know, 45 years ago or so. And I was sitting there listening to this guy, taking it all in. I mean, the first day of ninth grade is a big deal for any kid, really. This is a fair bit of apprehension and so forth. How is this going to be? I was really small, kind of intimidated by, I hadn't had my growth spurt at all yet. So I was probably about 5'2". I remember having to pry this I don't know, they were probably in 12th grade, who knows, maybe not. I had to pry this couple off my locker in between classes because they were like making out. It was very uncomfortable. But anyway, so getting off on a tangent here, forgive me. But so here I am in the auditorium, and this principal, to motivate us, he said, I want you to look to your left and look at your right. And so I did that. I looked to the person on my left and my right, and I just had this vague idea that these were two students who were not very serious about their studies or anything like that. And he said these words. He said, I just want you to know that you are all equal now. You are all equal. And what he was trying to do, I think, was to motivate those students who had never been motivated before. And he was basically saying, now you have a fresh start. You goofed off, you didn't do anything in middle school. Well, now is high school, and now you have a fresh start. And now you're all equals. Now you can make something of yourself. I realize now that's what he was trying to do. But for me, it was a horrifying experience because I just thought, what? I'm equal to these clowns on either side of me. This cannot be good. I just worked really hard in middle school, and now we're all equal. And then the more and more I thought of it, I suddenly realized, you know what? He's right. Nobody could care less what my grades were in middle school. And it didn't take long where my mind, I don't even know if I heard anything else that he said after that. My mind started spinning, and I'm like, what's going to happen? 4 years from now, I'm going to be sitting in some university, and they're going to say the same thing. Essentially, we don't care what you did in high school. It doesn't matter. You're all equal now. And then sometime after that, I'm going to be sitting, I guess, in some corporate job or something like that. And, they're not going to care what I did in university anymore. And so at that point, I just started to really question, well, what is the point of education? Why am I doing this? And for me, I had been, sucked into this whole existence of, well, the point is seemingly it's a competition. It's all about getting ahead so that you can do better and have a better GPA and better grades, and you play that whole game. And that game has, by the way, since that time, 45 years ago, has become a lot more intense. A lot more intense. And
Do you
I
think
went back and forth.
Do
Go
you think
ahead.
do you think the stakes have gotten bigger now than they were before?
I'm not convinced the stakes are bigger now. We're certainly, however, given that impression, right? And I think there is absolutely, I mean, the research on this is very clear. There is absolutely more anxiety now than there has been even just in the last 10, 15 years. The level of anxiety of our students, for instance, going to university, and I think especially amongst those students that consider themselves to be good students and that are working really hard, the level of anxiety is higher. I don't know if there have been studies about this, but I would not say that the level of interest and engagement in learning has increased. And so it was in that moment that I started to really question, what is the point of education? I have to say, me personally, I did go back and forth. I'm kind of a competitive individual myself. I was good at playing that game. Walking in, taking a test and getting good grades and that whole thing. And I did play that game. I had that moment in ninth grade where I'm like, why am I doing this? And then shortly after that, I forgot about it and jumped back in the treadmill and then continued to do it. And I basically remained on that treadmill, at times questioning things again, all the way through university. I went to a fairly competitive engineering school and, was good at playing the game. But then in the end, after, being in my 20s and so forth and having taught for a couple of years, and I started to question it again. What am I doing with these students? What is the purpose of this? And, I took some time off and in my mid 20s to travel around the world and which even, made me question it more, and came back and I just thought to myself, there's got to be some sort of educational system out there that has a more philosophical basis. It's doing more than just training students to, compete on this race on a treadmill, apparently. And so that really shifted. And I became a Waldorf educator at that point. I'm not sure at this point in my career, how important it is to be a Waldorf educator. For me, it was just, again, this search for meaningful education. And I like this word, meaningful.
Yeah, let
And
me
Waldorf
backtrack a second. Give me a second
yeah.
to backtrack with you. And were you always good at math? Were you aware? I mean, you're clearly a self-aware person. Even in ninth grade, when this principal came out and hit you with this, you had the wherewithal to look within yourself and say, well, yeah, maybe he has a point. So obviously you were a thinker. Was math easy for you?
Yeah, I'd say it was easy for me. And, yes, I am a thinker. And that, of course, especially for, a young adolescent, that can be a real curse.
No.
Just overthinking everything. And, I went through, I wouldn't say that I was, that I had any sort of serious emotional, mental health issues at all, but I definitely was probably on the, towards the spectrum of, I wouldn't say depression. I was never depressed, but I was, there were times where I was just not that excited about life and so forth. And so, as I said, my educational system, I just played this game. I did the homework. I did what I was expected and I got good grades and so forth. And yeah, it was pretty easy for me. I also remember being in high school and thinking pretty quickly that, this homework is completely pointless for me. It doesn't do me any good whatsoever. I don't need to, I was one of those kids that could sit in class, take it all in, and really not need to practice the skills stuff very much. And I really did come to think that homework was just busy work. And clearly the only reason why I was doing any homework was because of the negative repercussions. If I didn't do it, your homework grade would go down. And, I got to the point, even, I think it was in my senior year with AP calculus, I just didn't even bother to do the homework. It was such a waste. And, it had a negative effect on my grade. I think 10% of my grade was homework. And so I was starting at an A minus. So I pretty much just got A minuses instead of whatever else I would have gotten. And it
Work in
just
the
seemed like,
system.
yeah, it seemed like busy work. And that's what I did. I worked the system. And it wasn't until I really, and I can say this, it wasn't until I got my first job teaching in a Waldorf school when I was, I think, 31 years old, where suddenly I really started to ask, well, not only what is the purpose of education, but what are the best topics that I could bring to my students to really inspire them, so that it could be, from a Waldorf perspective, is what can I bring to these students so that it will have the best developmental effect upon them, given where they are where they are at this stage in their own personal development. And then I started to look at it through that lens. What curriculum topics, what are the things that I can bring to my students that would be the most beneficial in that regard? And so that was an interesting process as well, to kind of not only question the point of education, but what's the point of this particular topic? And what are the best topics that I could bring into the classroom to have that sort of positive effect? And then I started to ask, well, why have I started to realize, why did I lose my love of learning? Because naturally I'm a very curious person. I ask a lot of questions, ever since I was a small child. I question pretty much everything, and that's just kind of, my being. And
Hold
I
on a second.
started,
Jamie, hold on. So let's backtrack a second. I mean to interrupt you, but when did that catharsis, when did that awareness come to you that, hey, I really do love learning, and somehow between X age and X age, it was lost to me? Obviously, you recovered it in the best possible way, but there was clearly a path where the grind of learning got to you, and then your own introspection about the grind got to you. But at one point, you saw something in the world that said, "Wow, there!" You became a teacher. When you got off this treadmill that you were on, all the way through, you went all the way through school, 2 degrees in computer science, and yet somehow you gravitated towards teaching. Was that a form of learning for you? How did that happen?
well, I think what got me away from, you say the treadmill, you can also think of it as the flow of a river. And I'm kind of paddling down the river with everyone else. And I'm just going with the flow and doing what was kind of expected. And it was certainly expected, certainly with my background, to focus on what you're good at. Right. And for me, that was math and science, and engineering school was a natural fit. It's like, do what you're good at. And then, certainly computer science and computer programming was something that was a natural fit to me, that I was quite good at. However, I didn't bring me the joy that I was really needing. And I saw that. I also saw, ironically enough, I saw that I didn't want to be glued to the computer all the time. Of course, now I have a job where I am on the computer, but it's very different. I mean, for those of you who have done any computer programming, I'm good at that, but I can disappear into that world in a way that's not really healthy for me. And I saw that. And so I wanted to be in a more, interactive environment where I have more of the human connection. But you were asking, when did I lose that learning, that natural curiosity and love of learning? Young children have that quite naturally. And I just think slowly over time, the system does sort of turn them off to learning, unfortunately. And young children aren't really generally aware of that happening, for sure not. But I think grades and that sort of, that focus on competition, GPA and all that, it became more and more intense as the years went on. And as the game became more and more intense, the competition became more and more intense, you kind of lose focus of it. And, I did lose that love of learning. What I realized was that, by the time I finally came to a Waldorf school and I started to reawaken that love of learning that I had, and I found myself for the first time in a long time sitting down and exploring in math, doing what mathematicians really do. You start with a question, you explore something. Oh, look what I discovered, and I came to this realization that my formal my I came to this realization that my formal education had really drained me of my love of learning.
Hmm.
Or at least it had gone to sleep, and it really became reawakened. And that's what I see. I see that, you know, this emphasis now, of course, on standardized testing and all of this, and more emphasis on homework and kids. I didn't do that much homework in high school and graduated near the top of my class. I don't think that's possible anymore. For most kids, and certainly in a big public school, the amount of homework they get can be quite soul crushing, which is very
Yeah,
concerning to me.
absolutely. I mean, there's a belief that if a child does well in their grades, and they're getting these A's, and that somehow it's too easy for them, that has a detrimental side to it. So I think this busy work fills it up by creating a culture of uh, not having idle hands in a way. I think it doesn't give people. You've mentioned Waldorf education several times now, and I know what that is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But one of the things I liked about a Waldorf education is giving the idea that enters into a student a moment to breathe. And if you're always busy, you don't have a chance to let those things marinate, to think. Now, I see that you have a very philosophical approach to life, and just in the words that you're choosing, the way that you're coming across. Now, do you think that replacing homework with, that busy work with something more meaningful, what is it that you would replace? What do you give a child in place of homework that helps them move forward and sustains that love of learning?
Yeah, I mean, you just said a lot right there, and that's certainly very important. I think it depends upon the age of the child. For obviously young children, they really need some significant downtime, some unstructured downtime where they can really play and really live into their imagination. I think that that's so important, and I think things are too structured oftentimes with young children. But I do think that we can get to a stage. I mean, if I fast forward to high school, I can think of my own son, who it was good for him to be busy, but there's a difference in what kind of busy are we talking about, right? And I do think there's something to be said, or at least it was, for I can speak on my experience as a parent with my son, that if he had a lot of idle time getting back from school, this was not good, right? So he we wanted him to be busy. He liked to be busy. It was good for him to be busy, but there's a healthy busy and there's an unhealthy busy, right? If you're just being busy, just doing way too much busy work and head work and all of that, that's not a very balanced life. Whereas if you're balancing it with things that are going to help you be more healthy as a human being. So there's a certain amount of social activity during the day where you're doing something, perhaps with friends or family or something like that. And there's some physical activity. It could be that you're going for a hike, or it could be that you're involved in a sport. And so there's that physical aspect of doing things. And then there's an artistic part. For both of my children, I would argue, and they both, are doing very well now, and they're well into their 20s as adults, and they went to, what would be considered by most people very respectable universities and did very well there. Um, but for them, um, it was important to do the music, because I think the music is what has really helped to shape them a lot as in their adult life and as university students. It helped to give them discipline, and it helped to give purpose and focus to what they were doing. So that balance of having some intellectual studies that you're doing, and hopefully homework isn't just busy work. I've come to believe that skills work doesn't belong at home. If I'm going to give math homework, for instance, it should be thinking work. Oh, how do you think you could do this one thing? It should be something that really has some depth to it, that's hopefully inspirational to the students, and it makes them curious, as opposed to, skills work can really be done in a school setting more so. But to have
Yeah,
that,
I see that. I see.
intellectual work where we're challenging their thinking, and then to have, the music practice, and it doesn't have to be music, but to music or drama or art, and then the physical aspect, to have that kind of busy life, I think is really, really helpful, especially for many students who are, in the throes of adolescence. It can help guide them through that.
This is a wonderful view to have an understanding that downtime doesn't necessarily mean unproductive time. It definitely can have a productive value to it, but what tends to be categorized as productivity almost always has this harsh face to it. In fact, the
Yeah.
way that the arts have been stripped away from school is, well, it's a bit of a problem. I think that children. I've always believed, especially with my children, that range was important. Of course, you need to be able to do what you're talking about, the skill work, but you must have a range to the things that you do.
Yeah.
So this level of interest, the other thing that Waldorf education does is it really does touch upon a broad range of, well, it's trying to create Renaissance children, the way that people in antiquity almost looked at what a good life was, what a fulfilling life was. Do you think that there's a spiritual fulfillment in learning math?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a strange question. Is there a spiritual aspect to mathematics? Most people would say, well, where would you come up with that idea? I mean, I have a story that I tell about that, actually, that I had just been hired at this school, at this Waldorf school, and, I walked into eighth grade, and the teacher was very, very charismatic, inspirational teacher for this group of eighth grade students. She had really done an amazing job with them, and I walked into that classroom for the first time a bit nervous. I think 30 students were in the class, and she runs up to me and is very exuberant and jumps up, gives me a hug, and says, "Jamie, I'm so glad you're here because I hate math." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then she said, "But I know this. I know this. I know that math is where the students become most connected to the spiritual world." I mean, you could say that in different words, but I thought that was the weirdest thing I'd ever heard. It's like, what? I never thought of that, certainly in that way, because normally you think of, math as something that can be done by a robot, which to a large degree, the kind of math that we give our students could be done by a robot. It's very mechanical. Just follow the steps and you're good, right? But I mean, true mathematics, if it's done in the right way, if students are allowed to experience the wonders of mathematics, it should be a very, very creative subject. And it's not creative, is it? When the teacher just tells the students what to do, and they're just, going through those same steps that they were taught. And those sort of skills oriented things are, I mean, they're important, and learning math skills are important, but it's equally important, arguably perhaps more so, that they experience real math. And real math is a creative process, right? And so when you're in that creative space, as it is with art, as it can be with any creative endeavor, you're connecting to something more. And again, it depends on what your own spiritual philosophical outlook could be. But for me, you're connecting to spirit. There's something there. You're opening up this vessel. You're opening up this possibility of a new idea, and that's a highly creative process. And yeah, I do think in that regard, as is music and poetry and other creative endeavors, can also be spiritual in that regard. You're connecting to spirit. And this is human. This is what makes math or any creative subject really, this is what makes us human beings, is this possibility of connecting with spirit and doing something creative.
Yeah, I'm going to go back a second because you were talking about your own loss of just desire to the love of learning. We call it so many different things, but the reality is it's curiosity, right? You're curious about something. Someone has an answer, and the answer amazes you. It astonishes you, and then that astonishment it forms into a tiny bit of inspiration that now you seek more. You seek more of that idea. The knowledge becomes the hit. The curiosity becomes the vehicle that brings it to you. And this is where I consider that intersection between learning and spirituality is that it almost has to have you have to give a student a reason to ask a question. And the answer to that question has to be satisfying enough to want them to delve deeper into it. And there tends to be a backwards approach to that currently, but there always was that approach in antiquity. And definitely, I grew up in the 70s. They were experimenting with new math systems and teaching things. And personally, for myself, I had a major problem with numbers. I would transpose numbers once I got, 3 or 4 of them in a row. And I always got math problems wrong. So I thought, I don't know math. And that collapsed inside of me. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized, all I really did, I didn't have a good way of looking at math. And ultimately, I'm a computer programmer just like you. So you would imagine that my math skills aren't by any stretch of the imagination weak, but what they were definitely was undernourished.
Yeah,
What?
that's it. I completely agree with all of that, and it's sad. I mean, you've got one story. I can, you run into just about anybody as an adult, and the vast majority of people, not everyone, but the vast majority of people have math horror stories to tell you about what happened to them when they were in the classroom, and in many cases, and it wasn't that they had a bad teacher with a nasty intent or anything like that. That would be very rare. But they were somehow, the system, if you will, led them to this conclusion that I'm bad at math. I'm just not good at this, which is unfortunate, right? Because, there are these things that, I could talk about this at length, these myths of math. But one of these myths of math, if we're given this impression that if we make many mistakes, right, then we're not good at math, right? If we're not fast, we're not good at math. If we can't remember everything we were told from last year, we're not good at math, etc. But the reality is, again, going back to this idea that, I believe one of the most important things about teaching math is we're really imbuing a sense in the student of what it means to be a human being. This is one of the aspects of what it means to be a human being, is this ability to think mathematically, this ability to think creatively. And oftentimes the way that things are taught, I mean, it's understandable. If we're going to develop a standardized curriculum and test the students with these certain skills, we can see reasons why that it's become so skills focused. And yet
Yeah, yeah.
that what you were mentioning, the word that I think you were, or where my mind was going as you were speaking, was this idea of inspiring students. You mentioned this idea of awakening up a sense of awe and wonder. I mean, it's so much easier to teach a group of 5th grade students how to do long division and then get them to practice that. I mean, that's a pretty clear path that any teacher can go in the classroom and do. But the art
Yep.
of teaching is being able to okay, you do have to teach long division, but how can we awaken this sense of awe and wonder? That's the art of teaching, and that's quite a challenge to do, and yet it's so incredibly important. Because again, that's part of this thing about being a human being, is this sense of looking into the world with awe and wonder. And I have to say, this is one of my concerns about the world in general today. And this is probably going to make me seem like an old guy, It does seem that these new, these young, the youth today has become very cynical, but I think it is true. I think there's more cynicism today than what was, not that there wasn't any cynicism in the past, but, and why do we have such cynicism today? Why do we have such a negative view of the world and the state of the world and the human being? We have such a negative the message is also we're giving to children is a very unfortunate message for young children, adolescents, and young children to have to cope with. Is human beings are terrible and mean, and all these sort of things, and yet what is the antidote to that? It is to actually awaken a sense of awe and wonder. So they look at things and they say, wow, this is amazing. Mathematics is incredible. The world is amazing. The world is beautiful. I mean, these are the sort of things we want to instill in young children and to really help teenagers to get through. I mean, who would want to be a teenager again? I wouldn't. It's a hard time for many adolescents to navigate. And one of the great ways of helping them to navigate that is to show them that there's hope. We need to teach hope and awe and wonder and all these things. And yes, we also have to give them a realistic picture of the world so that they can really understand what the challenges are that we're facing. But we have to be really careful that we're not developing cynicism. And, mathematics, when it just becomes, it's just busy work, it's pointless, it's meaningless, that can help to develop cynicism, as can other things as well.
Yeah, I'm going to unpack that for a second here. I want to talk a little bit about that. The reality is that when you have this negative outlook, it's because you can't see a way out. That's a lack of problem solving skills. And young kids, they just don't have the ability to see their way through a complex problem. And society does a pretty poor job of understanding that you can't take something like climate change or a radical problem in the world and awaken or activate a 7 or 8 or 9 year old child with that. I mean, they don't have the tools or the ability to come up with a solution. Even if you're trying to inspire them to do as such, I think instead you're going back to making things so hard that that soul crushing experience closes them. It's the reverse, right? That's what I love about what you do is in your approach. It's very problem solving oriented. It's very okay to make mistakes because that's just getting you closer to the solution. Uh, as a computer programmer, of course, I had to do a lot of math, but really, I always looked at myself as developing puzzles. How do I make a puzzle? How do I fit those pieces together and ultimately come up with what I want? And as an engineer, you have end state thinking. Well, if you can't see a solution, you can never engage in end state thinking. And that's where cynicism comes in because they don't want it. I don't want it to be my fault. It's not my fault. It's got to be the fault of this uh, esoteric boogeyman of some sort. I think if we get back to teaching math and logic and in a beautiful and meaningful way, you're getting back to that point that you made. You want that instills hope, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and that's I think so important, especially for the younger child. And this world that we live in, there's a lot of blame. The world is this way, and here is who's to blame for this. You mentioned environment. There are big challenges facing the world. Is the world a worse place than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago? I don't think so. I mean, that's a whole
Not at
philosophical
all.
question in and of itself.
Right.
Is the world more complicated now than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Sure, right? But we're
Mm-hmm.
making progress, and we have big challenges, and there's bumps in the road, and all of this. And it is important that we give a very realistic and hopeful message to our children growing up, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so you just look at global warming, something like this. I mean, yeah, these are important challenges, right? They're complicated challenges. And again, this becomes philosophical. Do I feel that we as a human species on the earth can overcome these challenges? Absolutely. There are already many challenges that we have overcome. The fact today that as I live in Colorado, and I like to go from the mountains down to the city, etc. And you come over this knoll, as you come back from the mountains. And it used to be 35 years ago, every time you come over that knoll, you'd look and the pollution on the horizon as you looked at the city, it was like this orange, horrid cloud. And you don't see
Yeah.
that cloud very much anymore. I mean, there's one example where we've made progress and we can teach hope. Yes, I'm not trying to say we don't have environmental challenges facing us, but I am trying to say that we have made progress and will continue to make progress. And it's such an important thing for the young child. And we have to think of this. When is the right time for them to be wrestling with these kind of issues? It's not helpful for a young child to be told that, that the environmental situation is so bad that you're doomed and you'll be lucky to live, to 50 years old. It's only a slight exaggeration to what these kids are actually told, right? And
Right.
how can a young child deal with that? Only one way, really, is to completely block it out. Put up the barrier, put up the walls. And in the long run, it doesn't help in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't actually make them that's not going to help them to develop into adult that cares about the environmental issues facing the world. It just turns them off.
Yeah.
And so we need to find ways to bring it in the right way, in the right time. And yes, we need to encourage true problem solving. And what does that look like? Well, that's what real math is. Real math is when you look at a problem and you look at it and you say, I have no idea what to do. I mean, just one that came to mind here, I'll just mention this, is, take the number 10. The number 10 has 4 factors. So 1, 2, 5, and 10. Those numbers all divide evenly into 10. So the number 10 has 4 factors. Okay, so go ahead, solve this. Give me a number that has 13 factors. I gave that example right now just because it was very quick for me to state. I think most people listening to this right now can wrap their head around what the question is, but most people will look at that and go, I have no idea how to solve that. I've never seen it before. I don't know of it. You're probably not trying to, you're probably not going through thinking, oh, wait, there was a formula I learned in 8th grade. I'm trying to remember, what is that formula again? No, there's no formula for that. You have to think your way through it. And that's true problem solving. And, I remember thinking when I was in school, genuinely thinking when I was in high school, if my teacher ever gave me a problem on homework for which I was not told how to solve it, then that was like an illegal homework problem. Oh, it must have been my teacher didn't get to that part in his lecture today, right? Therefore, I have no idea how to do it. He didn't tell me how to do it. Therefore, yay, I don't have to do it. Yay, great. Because that's not allowed. A teacher's not allowed to give a problem to a student that they haven't been told how to solve. That's unfortunate, because true mathematics is that sort of thing, where you look at it and your first reaction is, okay, well, once you understand what the question is, first reaction should be, I have never seen this before. I have no idea what to do. And for many students today, they encounter that situation and they basically quit. They're like, I don't have the tools to deal with this. And what I want from my students is for them to look at that and, yeah, sure, say that. Yep, I have no idea what to do, never seen this before. But then the second thought entering their head should be, and that's what mathematics is, and I've encountered this before, and what the heck, I might as well try. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be successful, right? There's no guarantee that we're going to be successful, and I think that's healthy also. That in many cases in mathematics, you try to solve a problem, right? You make some progress at it, but maybe you don't come up with the right answer. Maybe you never have any idea what to do, but it still makes it more valuable when the teacher then perhaps guides the class through a little bit of the process of what that'll be. But this, we sometimes are given this strange notion in our classrooms that if I were a good student, right, then every problem I could possibly encounter, I would know how to solve. But the reality is that, there's another myth of math, right? If you're good at math, then it's easy, right? The reality is mathematicians, that's not what they do around. They don't sit around all day doing like easy things that they've done 50 times before, right? They're working on big problems that they still haven't figured out how to work on. And I'm not touting myself as a world-class mathematician. I'm much more of a teacher for sure. But as a mathematician, there are problems that I've worked on that for 10 years it took me before I actually came to a solution. Now that was awesome, right? And there are other problems in my head that I still haven't figured out the solution to, and that's part of what math is. So to give students a more realistic picture of mathematics, and as you mentioned, to give them true experiences of problem solving. What do you do when you encounter something that you don't know what to do? Well, you try and you try to figure it out, and you think outside the box, and you come up with creative, hopefully inspirational ideas about how to solve it. And you know, sometimes they succeed, hopefully, sometimes they don't. And those times when they can break through and solve it themselves, I mean, those are golden moments. And you try to
Hmm.
create those possibilities in the classroom. But for a student to look back at the end of the year and maybe even say, okay, there were 50 times over the course of the year, maybe, that I was given a problem that I had no idea what to do with. And, maybe 10 of them I figured it out, and that was really cool. That's okay. It doesn't seem like a very good batting average, 10 out of 50, but those 10 times can really feed you and give you a real sense of the wonders of math and really help you to advance, to that next level in your thinking. It can give you inspiration.
Wow. That's a beautiful, that's a beautiful breakdown. And I think of the parent in this equation. I mean, if you're dealing with young children, you're obviously dealing with the parents. And in many cases, these kids are struggling. You do an excellent job of explaining the struggle that a young mind goes through and some of the obstacles that they need to bulwark, strengthen against, and become better at. And as they become better and their improvement, their confidence will increase. But in many ways, parents are at a loss as to, well, how do I help my child? How do I make sure that my child, aside from a worksheet, they can't do the worksheet. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not capable or that they won't do well. What kind of advice do you have for a parent looking at this and saying, how do I look at this realistically and what's my solution?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And, I get this quite a bit where I'll be contacted, by a parent and they'll say, oh, it's terrible. My child is struggling with math. And I'll hear that quite a bit. And my first question
Mm-hmm.
is, well, how old is your child? Sometimes you'll get, oh, first grade, second grade, something like that. And that just,
Right, right.
and I'm not blaming parents because I can understand that. We live in a world where there's so much fear. There's so much fear in so many different levels. I mean, I spoke about how fear affects our education years and years before the pandemic, for instance. But, there seems to be increasingly more fear. And part of that fear is, oh no, if my child doesn't learn what they need to learn, math in particular, then, they're not going to be successful in life. There's a lot of pressure. And so, the first thing I say to parents with that question is, well, okay, grades 1 through 4, it's all about developing a sense of number. And how do you develop a sense of number? You play. And so let's keep it playful and not worry about the procedural skills. Oftentimes, they're doing long multiplication, long division. They're doing these skills oriented stuff way too young of an age when it's not really appropriate for the child and it's not helpful. So in those early years, you're just really trying to play with number and develop this sense of number that will serve them well. And then in fifth and sixth grade, okay, now we'll really focus more on mastering these procedural skills. Many of those procedural skills were introduced in a playful way in third and fourth grade, but in fifth and sixth, we can do more with it. But, and then of course, things become more skills oriented, more, I like to talk about procedural skills, which could be important, but it's not everything. We're led to believe that procedural skills are everything. And I just spoke about the importance of also engaging in problem solving and puzzles and developing mathematical thinking. But as the years progress, there's more. It does become more serious, understandably, because that's where they're at developmentally. And then, so for parents that have children in those age, say middle school years, etc., then what I would say is, well, first of all, struggle isn't bad. It isn't all bad. In fact, and I truly believe this, that the greatest success in math it always comes by working through struggle, the greatest successes. I mean, nobody is, sitting there with their arms up in the air cheering and thinking, wow, I can't believe I did this. Nobody's saying that if it was something that was easy for them, right?
Right.
It's something that came with struggle. That's an amazing thing. And, it could be that a child is in tears because they're struggling and they're really trying and they're not able to work. The tears aren't always bad. It shows that they care. And
Hmm.
really, tears can show that the child cares, and that's good. It's apathy that the thing is that I'm most concerned about. And yes, it is concerning if a child only struggles and never works through their struggles to experience success. And that again is part of the art of teaching. With me, that's been my whole career, is trying to find the right problems, the right puzzles at the right age for the right children, so that it can just take them to that limit, right? Take them to that edge of okay, this is something that I know as a teacher that they will be able to do it, or a good chance that they will, but it's going to really challenge them and it's going to be struggle. I mean, when I give a good problem to a student or to a group of students, I don't know if this makes sense, but I will be disappointed if they solve it super quickly. I'm hoping it's going to be something that's going to be the right amount of struggle. And I'm hoping that over time they'll work through it and have that experience that, as I said, can lead to what is the greatest feeling of success. And as I mentioned earlier, it could be, over the course of the year for them to look back and think, oh, these two or three experiences that I had, those were the best experiences I had, because I didn't think I could do it. I worked through my frustration in the end. I worked through the struggles, and I was able to do something I didn't think I could do. And that's magical. And that, again, that's part of the awe and wonder. And it also builds confidence, and it gives them a realistic picture of not only mathematics, but life. Life doesn't always come. There are life lessons that I hope my students can learn here, right? Because guess what? We're not always given the formulas and the recipes and the instructions for everything. There are times in life where we have to figure things out ourselves. We have to problem solve. And I'm hoping through math that they learn perseverance. They learn how to work through struggles. These are great life lessons, which are ultimately the most important thing that I think my students are learning in the classroom.
Well, let me tell you, that is a wonderful segue to what I was thinking about here. You do a really, really great job of building a well-rounded student. You care about that. There's a thoughtfulness that is behind these stories that you're telling, and you're definitely looking to develop a whole person. You want these skills to be translated, and it doesn't matter if they're doing science the next time, or they're doing maybe more liberal art, whether it's music, or maybe they're writing, maybe they're learning to read. All of these things build upon themselves because they push at the right level at the right time, and you get the right amount of success. And that's a little bit of a, you're trying to hit a trifecta. It's a little bit of a, it's a power shot. You're trying to shoot an arrow through a keyhole. But I do believe, and I say this from personal opinion because I've got daughters that have gone through your academy and your system, that when it works at a very high degree. They are extremely inspired, extremely ready and prepared to take on more and more complexity, both in life and in school. So can you tell me a little bit about how did you strike gold with this? Because obviously you wrote this book, this wonderful book, Making Math Meaningful, and now you have this academy, which I imagine has a way of teaching and a way of uh, integrating the student into the lessons. Can you tell us just very briefly how it works?
I mean, again, a few different questions there. How did I come about it? And that was, kind of a lifelong process, to be honest. And part of this was, in the beginning, it was an interesting experience to be told by this school, this first Waldorf school that I taught at, that we don't use textbooks. I don't blame the mathematical crisis that our society is in right now. I don't blame it on the teachers.
Hmm.
I do, if I'm going to place blame anywhere, if I need to do so. I'm not convinced that's always constructive, but I would say it's with these large textbook manufacturers that these textbooks that most all students are using, tend to not be inspirational for the students. It tends to be more of the grind. Um, but so when I first came to this Waldorf school and I said, we're not using textbooks, you need to create the material that you bring into the classroom yourself. That was certainly a huge challenge for me. And yet I'm the kind of person that really enjoys doing that. I enjoyed that creative process and I enjoyed it more and more the more I did it. So every night I would go home and think, what is going to be best for these students? And slowly over time, I developed a curriculum, and that curriculum is reflected in my Making Math Meaningful workbooks and teachers' source books and all of that. So I share that with other people that they could use. But I mean, partly this comes in, perhaps it was, sort of my destiny to be in this place in Colorado that's in some ways kind of the Wild West, and you can do whatever you want. Right. And, so I'm in a place that has a lot of freedom, honestly, and freedom in many, many different ways. But one of those ways as a teacher is I had the freedom without much pressure of saying what I had to teach. And we didn't have any standardized testing. And so I could create this curriculum essentially for what evolved into a grades 1 through 12 curriculum that I felt would prepare them, not only for mathematics that they might encounter in the future, not only for the university that they might go to, but prepare them for life as well, and to give them a sense of what mathematics really is as a human experience. So I was given that freedom to do that without the pressures that, of course, we find most everywhere in the world. Government exams, college entrance tests, all of these sort of things that really put a lot of pressure on the material. You have to get through all these topics, and there's all this pressure that's put on the teachers, and that pressure ultimately is then transferred onto the students as well. And so I didn't have that. And so I think that opened up the door for really developing this curriculum. So that's partly the answer, the first answer to the question that you asked. And then, how does this really work, and how does it manifest in the academy? I would say this, and this was, it's, I like to tell stories quite a bit. And, one of the stories I like to tell is I had decided it was time for me to focus on what I call my math missionary work. Up until that point in my life, I guess I was 53 years old. Up until that point, I had been teaching full-time at my school, and then during my vacations I would go and offer workshops for teachers, and in the summer I was working at a teacher training institute to help train teachers, and I was writing my books and doing all this work. And I realized it was a little too much, and I needed just focus on that other stuff. So I left my school where I taught for more than 20 years, Shining Mountain Waldorf School in Boulder, Colorado, which I certainly loved my experience there, but it was time for me to kind of venture out on my own. And so I traveled quite a bit for 2 years, and then my timing was impeccable because I finished my travel just before the onset of the pandemic. And also at that point, I had a group of homeschool parents approach me and say, Jamie, we love what you're doing here, but we really can't really bring it the way that we know it ought to be brought in our homeschool environment, in our own homeschool classes, and we need some help. Can you teach some homeschool classes? And that's where it began with the academy. And so this was 6 months before COVID, and that's September of 2019. And so I started with a small group, and we did this. And I wasn't very optimistic about it. I thought, how is this going to work? And a lot of people have prejudice against online learning, especially now after the pandemic, which I totally understand, because the way that it was done was not effective. And it was, there were those reasons, and then people were forced to do it against their will, and so on and so forth. But, I also had prejudices against online learning, I have to say, but I went forward and I did it. And we had these Zoom meetings with the students, and I did recorded lectures, and I created the whole structure, which still exists now 4 years later.
Wow.
And there was something that really happened that was completely unexpected. And that is, I had this inspiration or insight that for this to work, it has to be more than just watching recorded lectures. If all students are going to be doing is watching a screen, a recorded version of myself, give lectures, no matter how good those lectures were, it wouldn't be good. Because if it was just that and then slogging through, problems out of my own workbooks, there needed to be a human component to it. They needed to be connecting with other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did is we created this idea that twice a week, as much time that they would be watching me in a recorded lecture, they would be meeting with other students in these what I call group meetings, and they would be doing real math. And what I mean again by real math is real problem solving, puzzles, figuring out things, discovering things together with others. And this is what I think makes my program most unique. There are other certainly online learning systems out there that involve recorded lectures and working through problems in a workbook or whatever, but for our students to meet together in groups twice a week and to really do real math and struggle through working on problems that they don't know how to do has been really, really helpful. And so for years before this, I had always, talked to teachers about the importance of group work and working on puzzles and all of that. But it was actually the academy that forced me, for the first time in my career, to practice what I preach and actually give them a significant amount of time, a lot of time, to be doing the real math and the discovery and the problem solving and all of that. And so that's where this is, and that's why I can say, and it sounds like an outrageous statement, I'm not just trying to sell anybody, but it's true. This has been the most successful teaching of my career. It's not that I wasn't successful beforehand when I was teaching in person, but this has forced me to do more real problem solving, real math than I had ever done before, more group work, more of this. And that has made all the difference in the world, I'd say. And that's what makes it, again, this is what makes it meaningful. This is what makes it inspirational to the students, is when they're given that opportunity and they're able to do things that they didn't think that they could possibly do. That to me is real success.
Wow, that's a great story. One of many, by the way, but I find it interesting that the rest of the narrative surrounding COVID is how far behind children have gotten. They've gotten so far behind. They're behind in reading. They're behind in math. They're behind. We're still catching up. We don't know the fallout. And yet, here's this small group that you worked with, and nobody fell behind. Dare I say, they moved ahead. And I can tell you that this is 100% something I lived through. My daughter Juliet was in middle school. She took your classes through some Waldorf school that we had here locally in Florida. But when middle school came around, my wife and I became these parents that said, well, why don't we homeschool Juliet? And she came into it not the most confident regarding mathematics. And I can say that all of these stories that you've told have been echoed in her hard work, her ability to follow along with your course study, the group work, all of that. And I'll top it off with one last story that I think will be a little bit inspirational to some other folks. Well, here in Florida, the kids have to take an EOC in 8th grade, which is a standardized test that says, hey, where do we place you in high school for math? And Juliet was very nervous about being able to pass this test.
Yeah, quite understandably.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure. And to tell you the truth, it wasn't like we prepared her for the test. All we prepared her to do was think, and the things that your academy brought, the ideas, the problem solving. And she goes into this classroom. There's, probably 50 kids from all over that are taking the test, including her, now homeschooled. And they have 2 hours to complete this exam. Well, 2 hours go by. Everyone puts their pencils down. The teacher says, does anyone need more time? And, all the hands go up. And she notices that Juliet's hand didn't go up. And she goes, do you need more time? And she goes, no, I'm finished. And she was the only one who actually finished the exam in 2 hours. And I can happily report she received her score a few days ago. And she scored a 5, which is the highest you can score in this standardized test. And all of this coming from a child that was not part of the school system at all, just learn mathematics through your academy. And so, as a parent, I thank you for doing that. But more importantly, I think that the real person that benefited here was Juliet. And isn't that what we want from our kids? To benefit from their
Absolutely.
learning environment?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that story. I really do appreciate you sharing that because, that's why I teach, right? And again, it's, I've taught more than my share of really brilliant, gifted students in my career. But it's the ones who, kind of made something of a breakthrough. That it wasn't a shoe and it wasn't a given that they were going to be brilliant and successful no matter what. It's the ones that I feel like at least made a small difference in helping to make them to change their relationship to mathematics and to increase their confidence because that confidence goes a long way beyond the
Oh, yeah.
mathematics classroom. That can make a huge difference in someone's life. I did want to tag on to one other thing that you said there, and this is a
Okay.
good question. You were saying how it seems in today's world everyone is behind. It's a bizarre thing, isn't it? I mean, of course, it conjures up this race of it conjures up this image of a race, and so
The
we're all in this
treadmill.
foot race, right? And it's like you've got 2,000 people in this race and there's one person that's in the front and everyone else is behind. I mean, it's bizarre thinking, to be honest, and it's certainly not helpful thinking. But it is true there are many students who have, we'll just say, weaknesses in their skills. They're lacking confidence, all these things that come along with that awful label of being behind, right? And these can be legitimate concerns for parents. What do I do with my child? My child hates math. They don't have the skills that I would think that they need to have at this point. What do I do? And it's a curious thing because in many cases we have these unconscious assumptions in the back of our head. And the unconscious assumption is, well, if a child is weak with their skills, what we need to do is hammer them with a lot more skills work. They need more homework, not less. And the reason why I say this, and you can kind of tell by my choice of words there, is that it often isn't helpful. I mean, it may be for a rare student. Okay, just getting an extra hour of homework on, fractions every night is going to somehow have a positive effect. But for most students, it just makes them hate math more. And it's not actually going to do it. So I say, and this is, perhaps a little bit radical, to get a child like that that's in that situation, who has low confidence, who hates math, who has weak skills, etc., to turn the boat around. And by the way, it's totally doable to turn that boat around in, say,
Oh,
sixth or
yeah.
seventh grade. Sixth or
Oh, yeah.
seventh grade's an ideal time to do that. Trying to turn that boat around in ninth and 10th grade is a lot harder. It's a lot harder.
Yep.
I won't say it's
Yep. Yep.
hopeless, but you got to try to do it in sixth and seventh grade for sure. And so to turn that around, what do? Well, you engage them with interesting math, right? In a way, you ignore the holes and you express to them, you know what? I know you don't have confidence. I know you don't think that you can deal with fractions and long division, all this. That may or may not be true, but I have confidence in you. I think that you can actually do math, and somewhere in you is somebody who actually can be good at math. I'm going to give you a problem now that's really interesting. And so we find the right
Wow.
level of, again, puzzles and problem solving experiences, and to give them that experience where suddenly they can start to see the on wonder of mathematics. And again, the art of teaching is the right problem. You don't want to give them something that's so incredibly difficult they have no chance at it. But we give them the right kind of interesting, engaging problem where suddenly they can see, perhaps subconsciously, they can start to think, oh,
Right.
actually, I'm able to do this. Oh, actually, that's interesting. I'm enjoying this. And once you start to turn around their attitude and their relationship to mathematics, then at some point later, we can go back and say, well, remember that stuff with fractions that you had troubles with? Okay, well, now let's work a little bit on that. Now they have a different relationship to mathematics and a different desire to actually work on that. But we don't start with pummeling them with more skills. It usually does not work.
Well, 100%. You. If you're gonna do something dry, you just have no opportunity to get that inspiration underneath as leverage. It's that leverage, inspiration, their desire to want to learn more must come from success, but success doesn't find itself in one area. There are many different ways to leverage that. And I think that your books, the way that you approach things, I honestly think that every single child going from fourth, fifth into middle school would benefit from having this taught to them. There's no limit to it. I don't care if it's homeschool. It doesn't matter if it's Waldorf. It doesn't matter if there's another sort of modality that people want to say, public, private school. Making math meaningful, it really does have its place in today's educational environment.
Yeah, and my hope is that, we can, and I know there are good math teachers out there that know a lot of what we're talking about here. They know it, but they're caught in a system that's really not giving them the freedom to practice what they know. And that's where it's hard. And again, I think a lot of it is these textbooks. The textbooks tend to be really dry. But, just let me be clear here. I'm not arguing that skills aren't important. So yes, math skills are important. It's, for anybody, we want students to be able to go off to university and to be able to thrive and be successful in a university level math course. And you're not going to be able to do that if you can't speak the language, right? If you don't have the basic,
of course.
If you don't have the basic fundamental skills. But what I am saying is there's something more important than skills, and that is your ability to think mathematically, problem solve, and all of that. And most of all, the most important thing is what I spoke about a moment ago, is really having that healthy relationship to mathematics, to have the interest, to have the enthusiasm for learning. That's going to take you a long way, not only in your math courses, but it'll take you a long way in life if you have a passion and interest in all that you do.
Well, that's a beautiful stopping point for us. I'll tell you what, I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you have too.
Thank you.
It's really, yeah, it's there's many things I think that we can still talk about. Maybe we'll do this again. Let's do it again.
Sounds
we'll talk
good.
a little bit broadly. But Jamie York, I want to thank you very much for taking the time today. And I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And I'm so pleased that I was able to be here and have the conversation with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.